The 1850 Fugitive Slave Law is by far the most politically consequential law passed by Congress in the years before the Civil War. It was meant to improve the chances of slaveholders retaking their escaped slaves, but it did nothing of the sort. In fact, it made the situation considerably worse. Slaveholders who were attempting to recapture their slave ran into stiff opposition in free states, particularly in those large urban areas where there were considerable black populations. Those populations, along with abolitionist friends and acquaintances and co-workers, did all they could in their power to stifle the attempt by slaveholders and their agents to retake slaves. So this becomes a politically charged situation, one that would continue to grow worse as the decades progressed, so that by the time we get to the Civil War, those people who have decided to secede are still complaining about the fact that this law was never effectively enforced, nor were the communities in the North doing the job that was expected of them to support this law. Slaves escaped from all the border states in increasing numbers during the decades, so that by the time we get to the end of the 1850s, in the context of Harper's Ferry, in the context of the Dred Scott decision and other developments, the fugitive slave law was in effect a dead letter.
The interesting thing about slavery in Missouri is that by and large it was not plantation slavery. This is due to its geographic location. It was almost entirely surrounded by free states and territories, and also because of shorter growing seasons. So they did not grow a lot of cotton in Missouri. Instead, they engaged in diversified agriculture, where enslaved people were used in a variety of capacities. But the interesting thing about this small-scale system of slavery that developed in Missouri is how that affected people's living and working conditions, how they related with one another within these households, but also how that affected enslaved people's families and their community lives. In most cases, an enslaved man and woman who were a couple lived on different farms. So this meant that men traveled on the weekends to visit their families and were not with them for most of the week. There was also not a plantation slave quarter in Missouri. Instead, there were cross-farm slave communities. And what is really interesting about that is that it caused a lot of mobility of enslaved people in Missouri. They were able to travel around. They knew a lot of people within their communities. I think that they also, because of this, knew the local geography. And all of this was put into play at the moment that they decided to escape.
The Underground Railroad in Missouri differs from the pattern you see in most of the Midwest and even in the East, in that the Upper South, it tends to be very much a south to north movement to locations further north or even Canada. Missouri, because of its peculiar geographic location, actually lying to the east of a major free state, Illinois, lying south of another free state, Iowa, and lying to the east of a free territory, Kansas, ends up with a situation where a huge portion of its border is surrounded by freedom. And so slaves start running in all sorts of directions as Missouri develops. Probably the most enticing early on is the Mississippi. You can see freedom from the western shore. And slaves run to Illinois, go to locations like Springfield, the state capital, to abolitionist havens like Quincy, Knox College, to black communities like New Philadelphia, And it's been pretty well demonstrated that these are key conduits to help them get further away from Missouri. But it's a real convoluted kind of geography in the sense that, to use an example, in the western part of the state, it's developing more and more as a slave territory leading up to the Civil War. You have situations where activists like John Brown and his allies will take slaves out of Missouri, head west into free Kansas territory, north into Nebraska territory, and then actually put slaves on the railroad in Iowa to head eastward, not just an underground railroad, a true railroad, and take them all the way to the Detroit River borderland where they'll be ferried across. A good example is in between December 58 and March of 1859, where you have the Daniels family, a so-called slave stampede of 12 slaves with one born on the way, who make their way through that long route to freedom, which not only angers a lot of people in western Missouri, but demonstrates to abolitionists that at least they want to see it as a sign that things are moving in the right direction. And so Missouri's unique in many ways in terms of its slavery history and its runaway history.
The term slave stampedes is a term that we really start seeing in the 1840s. It appears in The Liberator, for instance, in 1847, in reference to an escape that happened from Maysville involving 5 slaves that escaped across the border, perhaps into Ripley, Ohio, which was a known Underground Railroad site. The use of the term stampede appears quite quickly after the term kind of enters into the American lexicon. The word stampede has either Germanic or Spanish roots, and we start to see it as the country is expanding west in reference to things like stampedes of horses or cattle, and it's quickly applied to slave stampedes. I think it's an important term to look at these kind of group escapes or these serial escapes because it really counters our notion of what the typical runaway slave looked like, which was usually a young male traveling alone. These slave escapes usually involved women, men, and children, and oftentimes people who were elderly. And I think that's one of the interesting things because it's complicating our understanding of the Underground Railroad and asking us to expand those concepts. And they really show how these debates over slavery and escapes get enmeshed in the political and moral debates of the time period. And I think that's what's kind of interesting about these all, is they're really expanding our concept of not only what escapes look like, but the arguments around these escapes and how they were, the tensions that surrounded these escapes were pushing the country towards civil war and civil unrest that will explode in the 1860s.
Freedom suits are something that very few people know about. If they know about them at all, the most famous one is brought by Dred Scott and his wife Harriet, who sued for freedom and lost. They lost tragically at the level of the United States Supreme Court. But before that, there were actually hundreds of freedom suits, and in Missouri, there were more than 300 freedom suits, which passed through the courts and redeemed freedom. Why do I say they redeemed freedom? Well, what redemption means is that you're already entitled to something because you've lived in free territory, and you're just collecting on the fact that you're entitled to it. You go to court to redeem your freedom because it's already yours. Redemption and freedom suits were not going to be successful for everyone. You had to have lived in free territory, or perhaps in the worst case scenario, you were already free and you were kidnapped and held as a slave.